I'm Anna Huysse, and that I'm a founder of the Hashimoto Help. And this initiative actually started with me searching relief for my own suffering, which actually later transferred to sharing my successful experience with people in my practice. And nowadays, the building is an online platform when hopefully more people can be reached and helped. And this webinar series, with a big enthusiasm, I've started with an idea that bringing together experts from different fields and clients and patients with Hashimoto or other immune diseases may open a platform of discussing what is relevant for people suffering and trigger scientists or others to do more in this area. So today we have a special guest, and it's Russo Kolts. Hi, Russo.
Hi.
Some words about you. Russo is a clinical psychologist and professor at Eastern Western University. He's really an anger expert. As he's an author of several books. Just show to you the Compassion Mind Guide to Managing Your Anger, the Buddhist Psychology Cognitive Behavioral Therapy a Clinician's Guide, Living with an Open Heart, Cultivating Compassion in Everyday Life, An Open-Hearted Life, and recently released CFT Made Simple. And he gave a TED talk of anger, compassion, and what it means to be strong, which created quite a big success, and people are very interested to look at it. Have I missed something, Russell? Do you want to say something more about yourself?
I think you've oversold me. Living with an Open Heart and An Open-Hearted Life are the same book.
Okay.
Living with an Open Heart's the UK edition, and Open-Hearted Life is the US edition. But thank you. What a wonderful introduction.
No. Yes. Let's see where we can start it. I just wanted to make clear for those who might not familiar with what is Hashimoto thyroiditis, that people with Hashimoto thyroiditis very often in the early stage of the disease experience extreme anger as a symptom of all the diagnoses that can be placed on them, as a depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, etc. And it is quite confusing and a really struggle. And of course, we know that this is not the only way why we can be angry or more up to anger. It can be a temperamental issue, or it can be triggered from disease. But I just wanted to make a point that this in the early stages is really a struggle.
Yeah, you know, I think there are a few things more frustrating than having something going on with your body and not feeling right, and going to medical professionals and seeking help and having them tell you all these different things and not being able to really figure out what it is. And I think that there's a lot of frustration and a lot of anger that can just go along with that, and being told that, oh, you've got a mental health disorder or something like this, and then being told something else the next week. You know, yes. It's very stressful, and I think there's a lot of anger around that can arise.
Yeah. And do you have a certain suggestion to the medical professional, for example, for colleagues? How what would be your advice?
Well, if I was to speak to medical professionals, I think that, and this is a bit of a stereotype, and I think a lot of times it's not true, because I think there are a lot of medical professionals who are very empathic or who are very compassionate. But I think the stereotype, which sometimes holds, is that physicians a lot of times don't have the most empathy. They're very, you know, cut and dried, very medical model. And so I think that what would be helpful to people are when a physician isn't sure, you know, to speak tentatively and compassionately and empathically and say, you know, this is my best guess right now. But the truth of the matter is, I haven't figured out yet what
Yes.
you're going through. And I know this must be really frustrating for you. And I can only imagine how stressful this could be, but we're going to keep working to figure it out. And I think, you know, just a little bit of compassion, a little bit of empathy there can help. But, you know, that's also tricky. I don't know the way it is, for example, in the Netherlands, but I know in the States, our physicians are booked up, you know, almost by the quarter hour. And, you know, I went to the emergency room for a physical issue about a month ago, and I had to wait like 3 hours to be seen. And it wasn't because no one wanted to see me. It was because there were that many other people who needed to be seen too. So I think it's very easy for physicians to get into this routine where they're just trying to move through patients as quickly as they can, not out of lack of compassion, but just because they've got other patients to see. So I think from the patient side too, if we can remind ourselves that it's not that the doctors are trying to not be compassionate, it's actually that they have a very stressful job too a lot of the time. But I do think if physicians could remind themselves, you know, keep an awareness of how frustrating it is for people when they come in and they don't get a clear answer, and to show a little compassion, I think that would be helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. In the Netherlands, it's not different than in America, what I've heard. And certainly we have a very strict gatekeepers, as they call the GPs, the general practitioners. So very often you don't even, until you're really almost dead, you're not transferred to the specialist. So you're constantly going back, if you need help, to the general practitioner, and they are really overbooked. You have a maximum of 10 minutes. So it's the waiting list is so. But let's see how we can and what we can bring to people who are suffering here. So we know that our emotions can be a trigger for certain health issues. So there is no anymore a question about it in the research. So it's like involving in the initiation and the progression of that autoimmune disease. We also know it. What I've seen for myself and also in the people I've worked with, also the people in the communities where I start talking, is that very often people are reporting certain early distressful long-term periods of their life. And we know of the research that early stressful experience, that people have higher chance to get autoimmune disease later in life. My own guess is that it's not the stress itself, but the lack of supportive system. There, and that we didn't build in, and we didn't internalize.
Well, I think the two interact. As you know, Anna, I operate from a theoretical framework of compassion-focused therapy. And so we talk about the different sorts of emotions people have, and we talk particularly about threat emotions, which are emotions that show up when we feel threatened and need to defend ourselves. And then we talk about safeness emotions. And as you know, that safeness system, feeling safe and content and comfortable and peaceful, that system acts to balance the threat system. Literally, chemicals like oxytocin from the safeness system will act on structures like the amygdala to help us feel less threatened. And in humans, we typically tend to feel safe through social support, through connection with people who like us and care about us and things like this. So I think there's this reciprocal process where if you're experiencing a lot of stress and a lot of frustration, and you've got the social support, that can balance that out. And so you're not stressed and angry and all the things that compromise your immune system in this ongoing way, if you have the social support to help you balance those emotions. On the other hand, if you don't have people that you perceive care about you and support you, then it's very hard to reduce those feelings of being threatened, because that's kind of how we do it. You know, the way we feel safe is through connection with others. And so if we don't have those connections, then it's easy to feel threat and more threat. So I think you're onto something there when you say that social support plays a big role in it.
But it can be also that this safe system is related to threats. So that for the people in Hashimoto, I've seen that it is difficult to really connect and feel safe, because the safety has been so long related to threats.
Yeah, tell me more what you mean. The safety's been created.
So when people come close to you and they or the people experience, you help them to get in contact with compassion, or just visualize even that someone is compassionate for them. That to receive this compassion triggers and threat emotion in people, because this is the way it has operated for so long.
Yes, yes. And this is particularly true in people with difficult attachment histories.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, the way it's supposed to work is that, you know, if we have these secure attachment histories where our caregivers are there when we need us, when we need them, and they support us and they comfort us when we're distressed, then we learn to feel safe in connection with others. And that's really how we're designed evolutionarily to work. But it gets much more tricky if our early caregivers weren't able to do that. Or if maybe we were traumatized or hurt or betrayed or things like this by people in our relationships, then we can experience those connections as threatening rather than as safe. And that presents us with a really tricky state of being, because that's we're designed to feel safe in connection with others. But if that becomes associated with threat, then it's very hard for that person to feel safe at all.
Yeah.
And so you combine that with an ongoing illness like Hashimoto's, and you can see a lot of anger and a lot of stress, and then nothing to really help reduce that.
Yeah.
And so that's very tricky. And so I think that speaks to your earlier point where you're talking about, can we make the medical establishment maybe feel a little more supportive, maybe so there's some social support built into that, which I think would be very helpful.
Yeah. What would be your advice for those who are really struggling to get in contact more, to calm themselves down, or to let others be helpful to them?
I think the first step is to connect with others who care about them. For example, you are doing what you're doing because you know what this is like. You've gone through it, and you want to provide some resources and some help for others. So I think even though it might not feel safe initially, for people to connect with support groups or to try and reach out. I mean, reaching out to friends is good, to have even someone you can talk to about what you're going through. But ultimately, I think it would be good to connect with other people who are struggling with some of the same physical issues, with the understanding that it's going to take a while before that feels really safe. That they're in we psychologists, we have this treatment called exposure. You know, if someone's been traumatized, exposure helps you learn to not be afraid of a new situation. And for people who have difficult attachment histories, interpersonal connection can almost be an exposure trial where you have to learn to feel safe in relationship to others. And so my advice to people who struggle with that is to try and be patient and have some compassion for themselves as they struggle with that, and with some assurance that if you do manage to connect with some people who genuinely share your experience and will care about you, that eventually those feelings of safeness will come.
Yeah.
You know, so you have, but it'll be a challenge, because if you haven't had those experiences, it can be tempting to just pull back and isolate.
Yeah. Yes.
You know, and one thing that occurs to me, since we're talking about connection and isolation, one of the things that I think in many people fuels anger quite a lot, and probably is related to immune system functioning, although I haven't seen these studies, is shame. And I think there can be a lot of shame for people who have physical problems that they don't understand, and they get in the way. And, you know, people invite you to do things and you don't feel good. And then they react to you like there's something wrong with you because you never feel good and you don't know what that is. I mean, I can see how a lot of shame could come up in there too. And, you know, I can see how that would complicate things. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, absolutely right. And yeah, I think the shame is an old issue you see with a lot of Hashimoto's, and that is not a new stage in the moment you become sick. It has a history, in my opinion, but you're absolutely right. In the current state, you are also somewhat restricted. If you want someone invites to go out, you cannot eat gluten, you should take the dairy out. There's so much restriction that made it much more difficult to socialize also. So there are small and big things that stay on the way. Yeah, you're right.
And I think for someone like that, it can be easy to feel like a burden and to just not want to bother because maybe you don't want to inconvenience others and things like this. And so my advice to that person would be, if there's someone who says, no, don't worry about it, it's not a big deal, I care about you, I want you to come, believe them, right? Try to not feel so much like a burden, and try to accept that actually, even though there's some things about your life that make things a little more difficult for you, that the people mean it when they express caring for you. And when they say they want you around, they mean that too. So, because I think a lot of times what happens is people will have people that really do care about them, but in their head they're thinking, well, I don't want to be a burden. They don't really want to be around me. I make things so difficult because of my physical issues. And so they stay home instead of go out. And I'd say if someone tells you they care about you and they want you along, believe them.
Yeah. But you said that about anger and being isolated. But it is the last research I've read, it was very, for me, funny to see that they're saying that that anger is related to the left brain hemisphere, which is actually related to closeness. And they explain this as anger might be triggering our need to come close to others and resolve it, because we need to be close to others to survive.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I might have another explanation for that, and I'm not sure. I mean, anger is an approach emotion. Anger really, at its purest form, if you look at the evolutionary function of anger, it's to motivate attack. It's self-protective. So there's an approach. When you're angry, when you're serving the evolved function of anger, you're not isolating, you're not pulling back, you're moving forward, you're attacking whatever's there. So that's what I would attribute it to. However, I think where the withdrawal can come in is that first, I suspect in Hashimoto folks, but also with lots of other people, in humans, anger oftentimes doesn't occur in isolation. It oftentimes will go along with depression, with anxiety, with fear, with sadness, with shame. In fact, I know a lot of people, particularly men, who shift into anger almost so they don't have to feel sadness or shame or anxiety. And I can imagine people who are struggling with these kind of difficult physical illnesses having that same effect too, because it's very, very stressful when something.
Thank you for bringing this point. Thank you for bringing it. Very important point, because I've seen the same with Hashimoto, exactly what you said, that most of Hashimoto's are women, not men, that are diagnosed with Hashimoto, but it's the same tendency what you described, is not to want to feel vulnerable feelings. Yeah. And in this sense, anger has been sort of survival mode long time. And it's, I think if you see, it served me when I was young, because I survived. In easy circumstances, but I don't need this anymore. I don't need to use this as a surviving strategy. I'm adult enough and strong enough to deal with my vulnerability also. I can handle these vulnerable emotions.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And if you think about it, what makes us feel more vulnerable than unexplained things going on with our bodies? Then our bodies, something going wrong and we don't understand it and there's nothing we can do. I mean, those are terrible, vulnerable feelings. And, anger feels really powerful. So it makes a lot of sense to me that people would shift into anger as a way to power through and survive, those feelings of vulnerability and frustration and stress that come up when you've got these physical symptoms.
Yeah, but you know very well that if you use anger as a suppressive, then it doesn't give you energy for long.
No, it doesn't. Well, and the other thing, particularly with these autoimmune diseases, is that we know that ongoing hostility impacts the immune system.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I don't know if you if in the Netherlands you have this phrase, robbing Peter to pay Paul, but it's a phrase where you're sort of taking from one pot and putting it in the other, but ultimately, no, you don't gain anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so in kind of like that, you're using anger to try and not feel vulnerable. Meanwhile, the physical effects of the anger actually are making you more physically vulnerable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I think that the anger that anger suppressed the immune system. It is no question. It does.
Yeah.
So that they use the saliva, I think, for immunoglobulin A to test it, and it was shown that is suppressing. And for me, it was really struggling to see that if just imagining an angry event, it was bringing the decrease 6 hours after imagining this event.
Yeah.
So long period, so it stays. It has an effect.
Yeah.
So what we create in our bodies.
Well, and that's an example of how tricky the human brain is. Because I mean, what you described, even just thinking about something that makes you angry triggers that. Well, you know, that's because we're the species that can do that. We have this ancient emotional brain. We talk about this in compassion-focused therapy all the time. The parts of our brain, like the amygdala, that process our emotions, we say are very powerful, but they're not very clever. So they can't tell the difference between threats coming at me from the outside and then thoughts and images that I'm creating in my mind. And so we can fuel our anger with these ways of thinking and these thoughts about the medical establishment, about our own bodies, about how unfair things. We can fuel our anger indefinitely. And the problem with that is that anger and the other threat emotions were really designed by nature to be rapid on, rapid off sort of responses. So, I mean, it makes a lot of sense that when anger fires up, your immune system goes down, because that's your body saying, okay, I've got an immediate threat that I have to fight off. So I'm turning all the other systems off, and I'm going to focus on all my resources towards fighting this threat. And so our anger wasn't designed to be an ongoing state of being. It was designed by evolution to be flipped on, used, and then flipped off when you're safe, when the physical threat. But we don't deal with physical threats a lot as much as we deal with mental threats, you know, thinking about things and these images. And so we can fuel this response, keeping it on indefinitely. And that's when you start seeing the chronic health problems. And, you know, I mean, it's no laughing matter. Ongoing hostility, like angry hostility, chronic hostility is associated with shorter lives.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, I think working with anger is something that a lot of folks have to deal with, and particularly if you've got a chronic, like an autoimmune disease, I think it's worth paying attention to. And the tricky thing around that, I think, is I don't want to give the message that your anger is bad or you shouldn't be feeling it. Because of course you would feel anger. Of course, if something like this is going on and you're not getting the help you need, or you don't understand what's going on in your body, of course you're going to feel a lot of anger. That's very threatening. But I think the key to working with that is actually to have some compassion for your own experience and to be able to say, oh, of course I would feel this way. What would be helpful?
Yes.
What would help me feel safe? What would help me feel connected? What would help me not carry this anger with me in this sort of chronic, ongoing sort of way? Because that's when it really hurts people, when it's something that they carry for days and weeks and months and years. You know, better to have some mindful awareness of, oh, wow, I've really been struggling with anger over whatever this is the last couple of days. What would be helpful to balance things out for me to shift from anger to feeling safe, even while I've got this stressful physical situation going on?
Yeah, but you see, by Hashimoto's, what I've seen is that anger is very often turned around. So the anger is towards myself. It is not towards you or others. So my experiences, and I'm really bravely stating to people, please take time to feel your anger, and it is there lays your strength. Because I absolutely agree with you. You need the support, you need the compassion, but I think that this in the turning it in the direction it should be is a very important step. because it was not my fault when I was a child. And I need first place to give the responsibility where it lays in order to open the doors. There for me was really opening and healing process when I started permitting myself to feel the anger, not reacting on it, but really staying with it.
Yeah.
And there I think the compassion is very important, because then it is, otherwise it is too much to handle it. It is a powerful emotion.
Absolutely. You know, in CFT, sometimes we talk about different versions of the self. And that's to point out that when I'm angry, I have a very different pattern of attention and thinking and motivation and behavior than when I'm sad, than when I'm excited, than when I'm feeling affectionate or competitive or defensive. And, you know, when you said we need to have, you said that really nicely, that the anger is important. And, you know, you were almost saying, it almost sounded like you're saying we need to have a compassion for the angry version of ourselves.
Yeah.
To actually recognize that that anger is valid, that it makes a lot of sense, and not to try and push that angry version of the self out of the room, but to take care of her too, to say, oh, of course you would be angry. This makes complete sense.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's a difference between taking care of the angry version of the self and putting her in charge of everything all the time.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. and that, you kind of said that. You said, I started healing when I got in touch with my anger. No, I didn't act on all of it, but I got in touch with it. And I think that's absolutely true.
I think a lot of people are scared when you say you should, we talk a lot about, if you look on also in the books, it's all about controlling anger, management of anger, controlling anger. And I think it is the first what comes to people's mind, you should do something to restrict it.
So, yeah, to get rid of it.
Controlling it. And I think it is not about controlling it, but people are very often afraid that if you feel it, I would do something that I would regret, or I would spoil a relationship that for me it's important. And what I think it's important to differentiate between emotion and behavior. So this emotion is not the same as behavior. You know, you don't need to be aggressive. Aggressive is not the same as being angry.
Now, I think what people mean, and I have to say, my anger book is called The Compassionate Mind Guide to Managing Your Anger. And I wasn't in love with that title. I didn't know a better one to give the publishers. But I see what you're saying, because it does imply that we need to get rid of something or reduce it. I think when people say manage your anger, what they really mean is don't fuel it indefinitely. Mm-hmm. Don't continue to think thoughts and to imagine things that just fuel and fuel and fuel and do nothing but fuel your anger. But at the same time, your anger is valid, and it needs to be recognized as such. And what I find a lot of times, there's a lot of anger and frustration in feeling like you're not being heard. And so I think that part of the best way we can manage anger, particularly in situations like this, is to give that version of the self that's really angry and upset the chance to actually share her or his perspective. So, I mean, imagine if you were really, really angry and I was sitting with you and I said, well, Anna, tell me about your anger. Tell me what you're angry about. And instead of trying to get you to stop feeling so angry, I actually was interested and let you give voice to all those angry thoughts and feelings. You know, I bet you wouldn't rage on for hours and hours and hours and hours. I bet you would, you know, in fairly short order, you'd take the time you needed and you get it out and you'd probably feel a little better once you were able to give voice to that anger and you got the idea that I believed that it was valid.
Wonderful point. Yes. Yeah.
You know, I think a lot of times when people's anger is fueled, it's because they don't have a chance to express it, and or nobody accepts that it's valid. Mm-hmm. And instead, it's like anger is one of those things. If you try to push it down, if you try to push it down, it gets stronger. You know, and I think so. We need to give that angry version of the self a chance to share her perspective or share his perspective. And, you know, I think when that happens, then that anger can give way to something else.
Yeah.
And I think in particularly like Hashimoto's and other sorts of illnesses like this, that something else will often be grief.
Yes.
Or sadness
Mm-hmm.
about the life that you don't get to have, or, you know, the things that are lost. And a lot of times that's what's underneath that anger, I think. And that's, for a lot of people, the really scary stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. But what about, we talked with you when in our previous talk, but I would like to bring it again, about our cultural coloring of who may or may not be angry. You know, there's in a lot of cultures, you see that men might have a more room for that, and women don't. And I think this might also play a role in what you said, that people, especially if it is a woman in front of you, and she flips up, then there is no so much room for her. And if it is a man, it's seen as being strong.
Yeah, I think that's true. I hope that it's changing. I feel like in my culture it's changing a little bit, where women are getting a little more cultural space to express anger. But I think historically that's absolutely right. In some senses, it was like that was the only emotion that it was really okay for men to express. And for women, it was the opposite. For women, you know, it's okay for you to be sad, and it's okay for you to be anxious or scared, but you really shouldn't even feel angry. Not only should you not express it, but you shouldn't even feel it. And I think that there are historically a lot of women have gotten that impression, that it's not only bad for me to express anger, but maybe I shouldn't even have it. Maybe if I'm feeling anger, that's even something bad about me. And that's absolutely a message we need to change. And I think this is changing in the field. I think there are more compassion-focused therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness-based therapies. There are a whole bunch of therapies right now that are focused on creating room for human beings to have all the experiences that come with being a human being. Mm-hmm. And we know if we really are honest with ourselves, that to be human means you will sometimes be sad, and you will sometimes be anxious and afraid, and you will sometimes be angry. That's just part of it for everybody. So it's ridiculous to tell some people you can feel this but not that, and tell other people you can feel that but not this. It's ridiculous. So absolutely, we need to create space for women to feel angry and for men to feel sad and anxious and afraid. And so if I'm sitting with a woman who's going on about how she's so angry about this experience she had with her doctor, hopefully my response to her, and I think it would be, is, well, of course. Does it make sense that you would feel angry? Because I would be angry about that. Yeah. You know? And in my experience, when someone responds that way to me, suddenly I feel a little better, because it's like, okay, I've been heard. You know, and my anger is real, and someone recognizes that. And, you know, that in some ways takes us full circle to where you mentioned social support. Because social support, the most helpful social support is not patting someone on the head and saying, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay. Because sometimes it's not going to be okay. Sometimes it sucks, and it's going to suck. You know, that's the way of a lot of physical illnesses. That's the way of getting old a lot of the time. So that for me, the most useful social support is not offering these kind of platitudes about, you know, how pretty the flowers are, but actually recognizing to people, or helping validate people's experience and saying, oh, of course you're angry. I'm so sorry. Gosh, that would make me angry too. Yeah. You know, I think that can be, now we also want to look at the pretty flowers, and we want to open our eyes up to the fact that there's actually a lot of beauty and a lot of wonderful things that go on in our lives, even in the face of the difficulties. But I don't think you can get there without really acknowledging the difficulties and the anger first. Mm-hmm. If you don't acknowledge the problem first, and you just try to move on to, oh, look at the things in life that are nice, it feels like you're just covering over it. Mm-hmm. Right? You're not dealing with it. So I think, you know, like we say in CFT all the time, compassion starts with getting up close to suffering. Mm-hmm. Right? And so I think that's what social support looks like for these folks, is actually sitting and listening to the pain and listening to the anger, and just accepting how valid it is, and expressing, gosh, I'm so sorry, you know, and it makes complete sense that you'd experience anger around this. And You know, is there anything I can do to help?
Mm-hmm.
You know?
This was what I wanted to bring in our discussion. It is, we talk about compassion a lot, but a lot of people, when you say compassion, even women, are saying, yeah, I don't want to be so soft. And if I'm so soft, people make use of me. Certainly because yeah, you used to use the anger as a survival strategy so long. So to be compassionate, it seems, yeah, strange. So to bring another point, I think compassion is, compassion is related to being kind, but it doesn't mean that you, it needs courage. It is a courage.
Yes. Well,
So,
it has to have courage.
yes.
I mean, compassion starts with coming face to face with suffering.
Yes.
You know, and you're absolutely right. And I get this whole compassion means you're soft thing. I mean, I do compassion work with angry men in prisons, you know, in the past. I've done this. So, you know, I get that resistance. But the whole idea behind compassion is compassion starts by coming face to face with what's really difficult and looking closely and say, oh, this is really hard. This is really horrible. This is really terrible. What are we going to do about this? Mm-hmm. That's what compassion is. Compassion isn't, you know, pink and fluffy and, oh, it's all going to be all right. That's not compassion. Compassion is, let's get down and dirty with the really difficult stuff and see, is there anything that could help here?
Yeah.
You know, and interestingly, anger, as important as it can be sometimes, often over time can become an avoidance strategy to actually not deal with whatever the suffering is. So instead of dealing with the shame, or instead of dealing with the fear about my not understanding my physical condition, or instead of dealing with the grief about the life I wanted but don't get to have, I turn that all into anger. So which is stronger, right? The anger that involves turning away from the really hard things, or compassion, which involves looking at it and saying, oh my gosh, there's a whole lot of grief. I'm heartbroken. Yeah. That my life isn't turning out the way I want it to. But you've got to start there so you can say, okay, so given the way my life is, what can I do? Mm-hmm. What would help? What would help me make a life that's fulfilling, that fits with the kind of person I want to be, that is filled with like beautiful moments and good relationships? But we have to start by acknowledging the difficulty that actually is there. Mm-hmm. We can't ignore it. We can't rage it away or pretend it doesn't exist and then expect to have a good life, because, you know, it's like this wound that's right under the skin that you're just ignoring and not doing anything about, you know.
Yeah. Would you like to give some example to guide us now? Some small experiential exercise, if you can think of how people can do this, if on their own, or just an example.
Yeah, I could do, you know, what we might do. I hadn't thought about doing this now, but why don't we try this? I'd like to do a compassionate self imagery exercise.
Okay.
And what we'll do is we'll have the person imagining themselves as having some really compassionate characteristics, and then having them relate to the angry version of themselves. Does that sound okay?
Okay. I'm eager to do it together.
Okay. So if you're comfortable, go ahead and allow your eyes to close. And we'll start with about a minute of what we call soothing rhythm breathing. So we're just going to slow down the breath, maybe 4 or 5 seconds on the in-breath, holding for a moment, 4 seconds on the out-breath. Just breathing nice and deeply and comfortably. Slowing down the body, slowing down the mind. Now what we're going to do is a little imagery exercise where you imagine having certain characteristics. And It doesn't matter if you feel like you actually have these qualities or not. We're going to approach it like a method actor would, who's taken a job, and actors often have to portray characters that are nothing like how they experience themselves to be. So we're just going to imagine what it would be if we had these characteristics. So to start, we're going to imagine what it would be like to be filled with a deeply kind motivation, to want to help others who are suffering, and to help ourselves. And if we find our attention being distracted by thoughts of irritation or frustration or anger, just noticing those thoughts and coming back to imagining what it would be like to be filled with this kind intention to help. Might even imagine what your facial expression would be if you were filled with this intention, how you would hold your body. Imagine that alongside this kind motivation to help, you were filled with a deep wisdom, an ability to see things from different perspectives, to be flexible, to draw upon your life's experience. So imagining kind and wise, and also being filled with a confident courage, a knowing that whatever arises in your mind or in your life, that you can work with that too. You can find a way, you can keep at it, you can find people who will help you, knowing that you don't have to have all the answers right now, but that whatever's happening, you can find a way to work with it. So here you are with these deeply compassionate qualities, this kind motivation to help all who are suffering, deep sense of wisdom, and a courageous confidence. And if you're following along with the recording and you have a hard time thinking of yourself like this, you might imagine if there's anyone that you know in your world who has these qualities, and imagine what it would be like to be them or to be like them. Now that we have these qualities kind of awakened, I'd like you to bring to mind a situation in your life in which you were frustrated or angry. Almost like we're looking back into the past to that angry version of the self who was really struggling. Maybe she was angry at herself. Maybe that angry version of you is doing a lot of self-attacking and criticizing yourself and shame. And as you look back at her from this place of compassion and kindness and wisdom and courage, see if it's possible to have some compassion for her. You see how hard it is for her. See how much she's struggling. Understand that she has really valid reasons for this struggle and this anger. See how hard that is. And imagine if you could be back with her as this kind, wise, courageous, compassionate being, how you might support her or encourage her. If you could give that angry version of you a gift of understanding, what would you want to help her understand? If you could whisper in her ear something that would be helpful, what would you want her to know? How would you want to help her feel? What would she need? to feel accepted and safe, understood. Imagine giving that to her. Sorry.
Yeah.
That was my coffee maker shutting off. And it's actually a good reminder, because a lot of times when we're doing these exercises, people think I can only do it if I have a perfect environment with no interruptions, perfect quiet. Better to have a sense of humor about it and kind of realize that this is the way life is. These little things happen. So we can nod. The damn coffee maker. Okay, back to the image. So you might imagine, if you can get back in the image, how that angry version of you or that struggling version of you might have felt if she could have received that support and encouragement and kindness. If that would have made a difference for her. And from this perspective of your current compassionate self, allow yourself to take some joy in being able to imagine how you might have supported her. Recognizing that her anger is valid, seeing her suffering and wanting to help, and then actually imagining helping. And in this imagery, you can kind of take time and shift back and forth between those two perspectives as much as you like. But for the purposes of this exercise, we can open our eyes now. And so, Anna, were you able to get a sense of that image of a struggling version of you?
Yeah.
What was it like to imagine extending compassion to her?
It was more understanding what was driving this anger.
Yeah.
At the moment I give a space for anger to be, not judging, just then for me it was very clear what was behind it.
Yeah. So you could see what that version of you needed.
Yeah.
And you could see that that anger was valid, and you could see the reasons for it.
Mm-hmm.
And you see, there was no part of it in which you were saying, look, you need to chill out and not be so angry, right? That wasn't part of it all. You were actually there and you could understand her. And it sounds like that understanding is part of what she needed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that exercise is just, it's a brief compassionate self exercise. So we're imagining having these compassionate qualities and then bringing them to a struggling version of ourselves. Sometimes people, you have some experience with this sort of thing. So I figured you could probably connect with that, hopefully fairly easily. Some people will struggle greatly with that, with the idea of extending compassion to any version of themselves, really. So if you're just starting out and that doesn't feel real, you could imagine someone you really care about who's suffering and extending compassion to them. Or you can imagine a child, or even if some people struggle extending compassion to other people, but they feel very connected to animals. So you can imagine your pet or an animal and extending compassion to them. By the way, if you're struggling with anger and a lot of problems like that, actually taking some time in the real world to go out and help others can be a great antidote to that as well. So to go to an animal shelter and walk dogs, or to go volunteer, even with, physical symptoms that can be very challenging, there's almost certain that there's something people can do that can be of help to others. And if you can create a little space in your life for that, there's actually research that shows that the person who benefits most from that is us. Yeah. Actually, in terms of our own happiness, helping others contributes to that more than actually trying to help ourselves. So to actually enact compassion in the real world can be a big help too, I think.
Yeah, wonderful point. I just want to make another point with you a little bit to discuss, because the literature is a little bit controversial about the effect of compassion on immunity.
Ah,
And I just want that we don't miss this point. But some people may say it is, yeah, but I would have much more problems with my autoimmune disease if I get in touch with compassion. Um, I'm really committed to do more research in this field. But up till now, what I've seen of myself and other people is it is the same like when you say I will do a detox, you know. And of course, when you have a detox diet, you would have an effect of, for some days, you would feel very sick. And I think the effect with compassion, this is my hypothesis, what happens is that from the beginning, we might indeed have a higher complaints of our symptoms and feel worse, but it is for a period of time.
yeah.
It is sort of healing process. It is, it is not, I do today one exercise and I'm healed. You know, it has to become part of your life, you know, to integrate in your life. So what do you think?
I would tend to agree with you. I think I have a couple thoughts on that. The first is that compassion does start with coming face to face with suffering. So if you're someone who spent a lot of energy avoiding all the difficulty, maybe through anger, maybe through any number of things. I mean, there are lots of things we do to avoid. And then you say, well, I'm not going to avoid anymore. I'm going to relate compassionately to my suffering. What that means is you're going to be a whole lot more aware of your suffering. Mm-hmm. And so you're going to be feeling the grief, and you're going to be feeling the sadness, and you're going to be feeling the shame, because you're not going to be covering that up anymore. And of course, that's going to be difficult. And probably that will play out in the immune system as well. But the key is you're not just feeling it. You're not just suffering for the sake of suffering. You're not just feeling it. You're feeling it so you can work with it and help. And the idea is that you're bringing warmth to it and kindness. And you're asking, what would help me as I work with this difficulty? And I think sometimes people miss, and they think compassion, sometimes they get the moved by suffering piece, but they miss the motivation to help piece. So they think that I'm just going to stay in the suffering and think about the suffering and wallow in the suffering and suffering. And yes, there's a deep acknowledging of the suffering, but there's also simultaneously a what would be helpful? How can I bring kindness to this? How can I help myself be comfortable as I work with it? How can I create social relationships that help support me as I do this work? So I think it's very tricky in terms of that research, because I think we can get, people can be confused about what compassion actually looks like when you're dealing with suffering. And so, of course, opening up the suffering is going to be difficult, but the key is if you're also bringing warmth to it and you're looking to help, then I think ultimately it's going to be of great benefit. Mm-hmm. But you got to have both. You can't just wallow in suffering and expect, you know.
Yeah.
You know, that's like they used to talk about depressive realism, you know, where they, have you heard of this? Depressive realism? Well, they did some studies, this is many years back, where they looked at people, the reality of people's beliefs about themselves and the world. And what they found is that depressed people are actually more accurate. Right? They're more accurate in their judgments of the way things work. Yeah. But the problem is, you know, accuracy without warmth isn't always helpful. Yeah. You know, accuracy without a helpful orientation. So that's the key about compassion. It acknowledges all the suffering, but you're also bringing warmth and kindness and a sincere motivation to help things get better. Yeah. And you've got to have both. Motivation to relieve it. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And is there a certain like routine that you would advise people to do? And what your thoughts about what might be helpful, like integrating in their daily life? We know that we're all complaining that we're busy, but I think we all have so many moments in the daily life where we can do small things that are beneficial.
Yeah, you know, I think there are lots of things. In fact, you were showing, not to make too much of a plug, but you showed some pictures of my books at the beginning of the interview. And the Open-Hearted Life, Living with an Open Heart book is a book of 3 to 5 page, brief written blurbs with practices at the end on how to bring compassion into your life. So that whole book was written as an answer to the question you just asked. If you want to cultivate compassion in your life, how do you do that without having to spend an hour on a meditation cushion every day?
Mm-hmm.
It's specifically designed for people who have very busy lives. So there are lots of little meditations, little contemplations we can do. So, for example, just a couple things. So if you want to start with compassion for others, when you're walking along and you're walking down the street, just every once in a while, the next person you meet, remind yourself that just like you, they only want to be happy and not suffer. And if you want to go a little deeper, maybe open your awareness to the fact that just like you, they have this whole life story that runs really deep and is filled with triumph and tragedy and struggle and success. And because a lot of times it's so easy to get caught up in our story that we forget that everyone else has a story that runs just as deep. And I think just bringing that awareness to mind a few times a day can help us not only see other people as real people, but also to feel more connected with them, because we then are aware that, they have struggles too. I may not see the struggles on their face because we all put on our game faces. We all want people to think we're, attractive and intelligent and smart and that we all have it together. But pretty much, it's you see this on the internet sometimes. Everyone you see is fighting their own battle. We just don't know what it is. So connecting with that awareness that we all have that depth of experience can actually, I think, help with the feeling of isolation, because there are a lot of people out there that struggle with these different things. I think it's like there are hundreds of thousands of people in the United States alone that struggle with Hashimoto's. Hundreds. I think I read this morning 200,000 or something like this, and maybe more. So it's a lot of people. And then, of course, there are lots of other things that people struggle with too. So that's one. Another practice that I think could be useful, particularly for people who deal with physical issues, is what if when you feel pain in your body, instead of tensing or instead of thinking, oh gosh, this is something else that's wrong with me, or whatever you do, what if we were just to try and extend some kindness to it? What if we can interpret that pain as that's a part of my body that's suffering, and how could I extend a little bit of kindness to it? And maybe even imagine that pain being surrounded with warmth and kindness and love. And there are some of these meditations I think are pretty powerful, because a lot of our pain is driven not by the primary source of the pain, but the muscle tension and things that follow it. And we can't maybe do anything about the source of the pain right now, but what if we, instead of doing our normal thing of tensing up and making it worse, if we could try to relax, slow down our breath, and actually extend some kindness to those areas of the body, and maybe that's something that would help. Yeah. So that's just a couple things, but there are any number of other methods people can use. And, there's books on self-compassion and things like that, I think, that are very useful. Kristen Neff, who's a self-compassion person, has an intervention or a little practice called the self-compassion break. And it just starts with the person saying to themselves, this is a moment of suffering. Yeah. Just recognizing that right now in my life, I'm suffering. This is hard. And then offering kindness to oneself and compassion. And so I think that the more we can replace that tendency to shift into self-attacking or shame or blame or judgment when those points of difficulty come up, and instead try to meet those moments with kindness and the motivation to understand and to help, I think the easier life gets.
Yeah. No, I find it probably a very good closure for our discussion. I'm so grateful that you took the time and energy and sharing your experience. I want to thank you once again, and probably if there are questions, can I just approach you with them back, that we can see how we can handle them? Yeah,
that'd be great.
Thank you, Russell. And I just want to make a point, if the others are listening later, that would go further with the webinars. And then our next guest is Paul Gilbert, and who will discuss particularly self-criticism and immunity. So 28th of September. Thank you once again, Russell. Have a nice day.
You too, Anna. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.